Welcome to the Bogart Effect, a wealthy wisdom podcast. The following Bogart Effect podcast is intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart or another investment professional. Please see important disclosure information at the end of the presentation. Hello, this is James Bogart. I got Morgan Veth with me today, and we're going to be talking about how to not be a burden on your kids.
Yes.
All right, shoot.
We could take this a lot of places.
I know.
Right?
I think it's probably, let's talk about the practical.
Yep.
And then let's get into the more emotional side of it. So when preparing for let's just say the kid conversation, or you're worried about ultimately the obligation, you have to start with a financial plan. Right. I mean,
first and foremost,
and frankly, I think any life event, you really should be integrating a financial plan into this conversation. And when we talk about being the burden on a kid, maybe let's talk about what does that really mean, right? I mean, there's obviously a financial component to this conversation when someone passes away. But I mean, to me, there's so many other parts of this conversation. There's being out of the country, right? Like let's have that conversation. There's just mentally not able to take care of yourself. Yep. And then there's the medical conversation, right? So let's dive in. Plan is kind of at the epicenter.
Plan's the core.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when I think about the plan, for me, it's number one, being as detailed as we can about the expenses. And so I jokingly say to clients, I don't care what you spend on grocery delivery or your Amazon or stamps or whatever it is, but I do strongly recommend that clients get really granular about their expenses versus, hey, I spend $10,000 a month, right? Go solve for that. And again, not because we care necessarily about each item in there, but it's because then I can look to say, hey, here's a really common category that you've missed. Like in the 18 years I've been doing this is a substantial one and it doesn't look like you've accounted for it.
Or medical, right? I mean, and a lot of when we build out our plans, as you're looking at this, we do inflate in certain expenses at different paces than others. Medical's one of them, but like, for example, if you have a mortgage still, we don't need to inflate that expense. Right. What the reality of it is all of our expenses are going up. Mm-hmm. And we talk about like the phases of life. We have the go-go phase, which is typically right at retirement. You're very active, you're healthy, you're able to do things. This whole being a burden on our kids usually isn't a very big conversation then. You start to transition to the slow go, and then ultimately it becomes the no-go. And the thing is that expense profile, that active phase, you're usually spending more.
A lot more.
And there's a scenario where even though the cost of what a loaf of bread is or a medicine is rising, but a household most likely will actually be spending less as they age simply because they're not being quite as active. Yep. So when we talk about that transition, I think probably the biggest one that we need to be planning for is long-term care, correct?
Absolutely.
So, talk about the planning process as we model for what is long-term care.
Yep.
And then ultimately some of the decisions that a household's going to need to make associated with that.
Yep. Let's talk about that. So long-term care is huge, right? So in this area, so Genworth just did a study. So if anyone's listening and you're interested, go to the Genworth website, type in your zip code, and it'll show you all of the numbers. So for 2023, the average for private full-blown care, right? $13,600.
Okay.
In
Northern Virginia?
Northern Virginia. That's today. And that goes up higher than the rate of average inflation.
That's with no specialties, right? Like that's just normal long-term care.
Right.
And when I say specialty, it's usually like cognitive impairment, memory care, cognitive impairment, tracheotomies, like anything that requires advanced.
Supplies. Yeah. Right.
Well, so I want to take a quick step back on this one. What is the definition of long-term care? Like what triggers that, right? So it's 2 of the 6 activities of daily living, meaning you can't perform them. So it's dressing yourself, it's feeding yourself, transferring from bed to chair, bathing, going up and down stairs, or cognitive impairment. And they define that as you're a risk to yourself or someone else.
Yep.
Right. So that's the trigger. And when we're having this conversation around long-term care, I personally like to go into it more armed and educated. Than like, oops. And when we talk about how to not be a burden on our children, well, frankly, this is probably at the epicenter of it because as you're identifying, $13,000 a month, I mean, and I think that the scenario that's probably the most detrimental to a plan is we have a spouse that requires long-term care, and then we have a very healthy and active other spouse, right? So now you've got an active and healthy spouse who's still living their best life, still has their normal expense profile. And then now we have this expense structure for a long-term care need that we can't perfectly time, right? Like no one's going to be able to tell us the exact day they're going to have long-term care. But I think tying it back to this conversation of how to prepare for not being a burden on the kids, I think it has to start obviously with the plan. Let's model the expense. Let's financially be prepared for it. But I honestly think that part of the conversation has to be preparing the family on what you would like to have happen.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think of like actuarially, husband, you know, typically will have the advanced need first. And then surviving spouse historically will have it second, right? This is just using actuarial numbers. A lot of times you're able to stay home with the first one, right? Assuming it's not advanced with specialized care. But that, of course, means it's a little less cost. But you're staying home, you might be able to bring in a nurse. And
home care is maybe $5,000 to $6,000.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah,
Still an expense.
It's an expense, but it's not as disruptive as, say, for example, where you have both, you know, someone goes in full long-term care and then the surviving spouse still has their expense profile, right? So, but I think you have to have, obviously, financially prepare for it, but the family needs to have a conversation of what is the game plan. And frankly, you know, there's a financial conversation here, but there's also an extremely emotional one, right?
Absolutely.
Like, you know, and no one likes dealing with the aging process. I think about my grandparents, ultimately. My grandma actually went aged first, right? And it was one where it was extremely emotionally tolling on my dad and his siblings because the plan, which was I would say more dictated to them, was to keep grandma at home, right? And then each of the children come in and help. Well, all five of the kids, my dad and his siblings, were all at working age. None of them had retired yet. So it was a huge burden while they were working. Some of them running businesses. I mean, and then trying to help with taking care of their mom, my grandma. You know, and that wasn't a conversation that anybody had ahead of time. And candidly, the resources were there. So, I mean, it was one that it created a little bit of animosity amongst the kids, right? So that's why I think this family conversation is so important because, you know, frankly, I might have my intent and you might have your intent for your family. And frankly, if we don't communicate that to anybody, then it's no good. It's no good. You know, and of course, there are going to be elements where things trigger, right? Cognitive, as an example, right? Like that automatically means, you know, additional level of care that might not be, especially if someone's a risk to themselves, right? Where they can't just be at home.
In-home is an option.
And in-home's not an option. And that's a pathway. So I do typically say, as we're going through this planning process, if Alzheimer's, if dementia, those are kind of pre-existing elements within your genetics, yeah, we probably should model that out. So this long-term care conversation, let's talk a little bit about financially. I mean, Genworth is one of the companies that has fantastic resources. We've seen the landscape change dramatically over the last couple of years. I always say there's 4 options, all right? The first, the default, self-insure. And truthfully, self-insurance means you have the most flexibility because frankly, you're paying for it, right? There's no insurance company that's coming in and helping with that. Let's talk a little bit about the other 3 though, right? So you mentioned Genworth. Genworth is probably one of the bigger ones. They're kind of more of use it or lose it type of policy, right? I know AARP has some resources there as well.
Absolutely.
You know, that's also one that we can pull off of. But those by design are you sign up for what you want, right? So it can be anywhere from $300 a day for 3 years, right? So it's like a daily average. That's more of what we call the Chevy.
Like a traditional policy,
And then you have like the Ferraris, which would be like $1,000 a day for 10 years. I mean, that's a lot of coverage. And naturally, the more you buy, the more expensive it's going to be. The big negative with those, though, is if you don't use them, you lose them, right? So there's no residual left behind. The next 2 I look at is they're really insurance products that we're adding some long-term care coverage on top, right? I mean, it's using an insurance policy as the chassis to build these out, but
with the long-term care rider.
Exactly. So it's a whole life policy. It does have a residual life insurance component built into it, so there is some residual left behind. It's a frankly terrible insurance policy, but it wasn't built that way. It was built for long-term care, and using the insurance chassis as the conduit to be able to have that tax-free growth, assuming it's used for long-term care. And then the last one is like a prepay, right? Where you just take a chunk of money, you put it into one of these insurance policies, and at that point, you're able to leverage that benefit.
Exactly.
Up front. So, again, as we're talking about planning, I think it's so important we build out the plan.
Huge.
Model these scenarios and essentially stress test the plan, right?
Well, that's what I always say. To your point, one very viable option for some people might be self-insurance. So my goal isn't necessarily that everyone needs long-term care insurance, but if we are choosing to self-insure for this cost, I want to make sure it's intentional.
Correct.
It's not an oversight. It isn't like, oh, whoops, my advisor didn't go through it, so here we are, right? Too late. So it's a very much can be a viable option. I just want to make sure it's intentional because we've explored everything else, went through the pros and cons, and that worked best for you and your family.
Well, and every family is going to be different in not only their perspective, the assets, the expense profile. I mean, frankly, these things are not inexpensive any longer.
No.
I look at one my mom has actually, it's a group long-term care policy. When she turned 60, she'll kill me for saying her age, but when she turned 60, the premiums went up 27%, right? And then when she turned 65, aging my mom, it all of a sudden went up in a roughly 70%. Yep. That was a very difficult conversation of what are we going to be doing relative to covering her need, because she's single, right? So, then it's resources to self-insure. Yep. Are we going to pay more now to get the same level of coverage that we thought we were going to get? Are we going to reduce the coverage to keep the costs the same? And so that's part of this family conversation that directly interfaces with the financial plan. So tying all of that back, we talked about long-term care. What are the documents that a household needs? And I think that it's so important to make sure your kids know where these things are.
Where are they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We talked about the life events. Obviously, long-term care is one, but even if you're out of the country, right, or obviously mentally, physically not able to make decisions on yourself.
If you're incapacitated, right? Yeah. You want to have that power of attorney in place. And so great, I've got my power of attorney. It first goes to my spouse, the next goes to my children. Something happens and my child needs to use it. Well, if they don't know where it is, how are they going to go to the financial institution? Where do they go to do that? Sure, you can go to Schwab, you can go to any of the brokerage firms, and also they have their own power of attorney forms. But guess what they need? To be notarized. Yeah. Right? Yep, and so if your parent's incapacitated, you can't find their documents. Well, here's this one. But great, I also can't do that because it needs a notary. So it's great to have the estate plan. It's great to have the conversation, but let them know where the documents are located.
Well, and I think, conversations,
simple, right?
It is, but it's not. Like I'm thinking of my dad right now, and he and I just revisited this conversation, right? And it's, they're in this safe. And then he goes, it's a biometric safe. Well, that's good luck. This doesn't do me a whole lot of good if I'm not on your safe, right? Of course, but that's part of it, right? I also think related to this, anyone who's interfacing with an advisor, they really should have a copy of these documents as well.
Yep, and we do, right? We have a secure
way. For all
of
our clients, we keep them on a secure portal we have. I think if you're using an advisor, make sure your advisor, who's your trusted contact, also has a copy
Put it in your vault.
These.
Yep.
So that, because a lot of times, one of the things I like to train our clients on is make sure your kids know who we are if they're not already clients, right? We don't want to be mom and dad's advisor. We want to be theirs as well. Yep. But it's one where they know mom and dad, something happened or they're somewhere and they need us to be able to help. Well, we can help if we have a copy of the document. So to me, it's the will, the power of attorney, the medical directives. If there's trust documents, have all of those in there. Secure data portals, they're awesome for that. Yep. Digitize it. That way we're not relying on paper folders somewhere hidden on the shelf.
So they know how to access them, right? It seems simple, but it's crucial.
Frankly, I'm going to throw a couple other things in there while we're talking about this conversation, though. If the kids need to have access to the safes, they know where the safe codes are or how to get them. A lot of households, to make it simple, they have a one-pager with those types of things that they put in their secure portals. Yep. That then, if something were to happen, we're able to pull that for them. Yep. Things like that. It's all personal preference, but I do think this all interfaces with this family conversation.
It does.
And certain kids are going to be more capable of having these burdens and responsibilities than others, right? So I know you and I did one on how to prepare the podcast on how to prepare the kids. This is kind of the other end of the spectrum of this conversation.
But still related.
But it is directly related, right? And it all has an interface with each other. I still think at the epicenter of this conversation is that financial plan.
Absolutely. So
we've talked about kind of the practical side of this. Maybe let's talk a little bit about the emotional side of this. Talk to me a little bit about how do you have this conversation with your kids?
Yeah. So I think, we kind of talked last time, it depends on their age, but let's just assume they are of the age that you've come into peership, right? So you feel comfortable kind of having that conversation with them. It's tough, but I think the risk of not having it is so great on the total plan. Find that comfortable space, right? Have it at home. Have your financial advisor involved, right? I mean, we've done that as well.
I actually did one earlier today. And the thing is you don't have to share the assets, right? Like it could just be the kids join for 15 or 30 minutes on the front end of a meeting. Yep. I know you and I have done a joint one where kids have come in, right? Where the kids sat in for a couple minutes. We talked about their pertinent things or things that mom and dad wanted to interface with. And then they left the room and we continued on with the rest of it. I've also had ones where, parents want their 18-year-olds, for example, to hear everything, right? Yep. Every household's a little different in that regards. But I think the reality of it is, especially when we're talking about your wills, your wishes, your wants, it's important to communicate those at some point or another. Now, if they don't have a financial advisor, I assume it's the same conversation.
It's the same conversation, right? I mean, you got to be vulnerable to say, hey, here's my wishes if something were to happen to me. Here's the local care center that I'd want to go to, a retirement home, right? Or I've already done some research, or we do have these veteran benefits. So just to have that conversation. I had a client, for example, who very much could self-insure, financially fine too. And he said, you know what? I don't want my kids having to think about, do I want my dollars spent on this like creme de la creme kind of, institution where I would be. So I bought a life insurance policy. I bought the long-term care policy, right? To kind of cover that and just like squash it, make that decision for them and let it be known. So even if you don't have a financial advisor, it's still sitting down to say, here's what I would want to happen, right? These are eventual things. We've got to have a conversation about it. Not sit currently. That's probably where the kid's mind's going to go. But here's what I would want to happen.
Well, it's funny because I had thinking of my dad. He's like, "Yeah, you're not going to do anything nice for me." And I said, "Why would you say that, right? Like you need to tell me what you want, right? And is it in-home care? Is it the Taj Mahal? Is it somewhere close and convenient?" And actually, that's probably a good one too. When we talk about preparing for, like, I'm thinking of my parents at this point, but like, let's say they don't live nearby.
Yep.
That needs to be part of this family conversation, right? Like, one of the kids needs to be able to be close by to be able to at least interface, right? I think of my wife's grandmother, right? So it'd be my married in grandma. Right?
I don't know the term.
But it was one where she had her son nearby, but daughter and other son were geographically not. And of course they had to come up. But she wanted to stay close to where they grew up. So at least the son was nearby. Someone was able to go in and check in on her at whatever iteration. And if something happened, was able to get there quickly. Yep. Going into a long-term care facility that's hours and hours away and something happens, which I hate to say it, but inevitably when you're in a long-term care facility, something is going to happen. You want that ease of access and somebody who can be there and have that presence. I think obviously we look at the cost of where you're at, but I do think there's significant value in having family nearby.
Absolutely. Right? Same. I mean, I'm from Mississippi, right? That's where my parents live. And so that's where they want to stay, right? If something were to happen, I don't think they probably want me trucking them up to Virginia.
They might. Again, I think that's
a great
example. Yep. Like, it's not on you or I to make the assumption of that's what they want, right? Like, I think again, I'll use my dad. It's like he'll want to be near he'll want to be near the kids and the grandkids, right? So yes, he spends a lot of time in Florida, but there's no reason for him to be in a long-term care facility in Florida by himself, right? So that's an example of where, again, we're actively having this conversation right now, right? So, it's one where we would want to interface that. And again, whatever his wishes ultimately are, that's where we want to go facilitate. Yep. And there's two parts of this conversation, because I have seen so many instances where the nature and the dynamic of like, how do we care for mom and dad? And then it just creates this contest between the siblings, right? Where, and some of the siblings, they might be counting on an inheritance. Some of them might not. I think this still comes back to this family conversation that has to be had. If you don't have it, we're creating liability, right? And that's why I think it's so important as we align the family to have this conversation. Yes, we want to make sure financially you're not a burden, but also we want to make sure at that emotional level, right? It's not a burden. What else we need to talk about today related to this?
I would say the other one, kind of maybe a small one, but just thinking about, kids and larger expenses later in life, if, they boomerang back into the house or there's kind of a one-off expense. So, if that isn't in the plan as we're updating the plan, sometimes that's having the tough conversation with the child then about, here's what expenses look like. So I know it's really hard at that point to, I wouldn't say cut them off, not saying you're kicking them out of the house, but just thinking about the support and level of care that you can give to your kids and when they're adults to say, right, you don't want to bankrupt them later on.
Well, so you don't want the kids to bankrupt mom and dad, right? Like, yeah, absolutely.
Or hey, I know I'm going to cover undergrad, but then there's this huge expensive master's program that wasn't in the plan. Well, let's think about it, right? We can finance it. There are, student loans and other ways that we can take that. You can't necessarily take a loan for your retirement. So just making sure, again, you're updating the plan to say, here's this new kind of large expense that we hadn't planned for. Can it fit in the plan? Can it work?
Well, and not to beat a dead horse here, but this is an exact example as to why this financial plan needs to be the epicenter of every conversation. I mean, the investments are one conversation. The estate planning is one. This long-term care conversation is one. But at the epicenter really is the plan and how everything else interfaces. We talk about this a lot. At the end of the day, it's a very simple economic conversation. What do you spend versus what do you have, right? And that's what determines long-term success. Things like kids coming back into the picture and adding to the expenses, or grandkids, or this long-term care conversation, all of that has a direct impact ultimately on survivability or and we've got a client who absolutely love the way that they think, but they literally have their dedicated long-term care bucket. Like that's just, instead of buying insurance, they
it's a Roth IRA. That's what right.
But actually he decided to use after-tax funds, and that's just for peace of mind. That is the low risk bucket, right? And for so it's treasury, CDs. It's low risk. Now we can't tell when that long-term timeline event would happen. Of course, right now we're able to get something in the 5s, and that's a good number. Right. Longer term, that number will probably come down a little bit, but it allows that household to feel comfortable that regardless of what happens, they're set, right? And and then the same household, right? But he's thinking about how does he take care of his kids, right? Which that's an interesting dynamic, adult children, right? But this is all where every household has a little bit of a different nuance associated with this family conversation, where in some instances, we as parents always think about our kids, but at some point you have to come full circle and think back to yourselves and what are the impacts of the decisions we're making today going to have 30 years from now.
Right.
Back to the survivability
still back to
of
the kids, right, too, right? I mean, that's the thing is, here's the wedding budget, and gosh, it's getting out of hand a little bit, right? And it's great. Like, I have 3 kids. Who wants to say no to them when it's for fun things like that? But if you're going above budget now, you're going to be a burden to them 30 years from now in a much greater way, right? So
very well put. Which that coming full circle to this conversation, it still comes back to that financial plan.
It's fun,
Morgan, I enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, it was great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
The previous podcast was intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart or another investment professional. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that the future performance of any specific investment, strategy, or service will be profitable, suitable, or successful. Bogart is not a law firm or accounting firm, and no portion of its services should be construed as legal or accounting advice. There is no guarantee a client will experience a certain level of results if Bogart is engaged. Our brochure describing services and fees can be found at www.bogartwealth.com.